No controversy whatsoever, no debate, no criticism. This was an unbelievable, somewhat one-sided win by Sean freaking Strickland. We did not say a word to each other before recording this. It is all fresh. I don't have the words. Chuck, you have the words for what we just witnessed.
You know, man, the first thing that I thought, and I just tweeted this out too, is this is a sport that happily makes fools of us all. It really does, because every time you think you have a beat on something that you kind of understand, or you have a very strong inkling, or even a technical like awareness, or whatever it is, it can just go up in flames. But this on this scale, you just said it perfectly, man. Him to watch that fight unfold was. It was almost like I was afraid to even say anything, because you're like, I don't know, this feels like it could turn any second. Those are the best kind of fights. They live on a tension ride. But as it kept going, when you're thinking Israel Adesanya is going to start coming on strong, they always talk about him becoming a rhythm fighter, getting the feel of the fight, and then starting to come to life with that rhythm and all that. When you realized it was discordant and he couldn't find it, and it was just going the other way, that it was going to be Strickland outstriking and not using his wrestling, not grappling, not doing any of this, landing the jab, mixing it. It was like, I was like you always say, like the theater. I was like, this is crazy theater, especially as we got into the championship rounds. As it played out, man, I just was I was texting with you and a coworker, but I was like, I'm still in shock a little bit. I really am. I mean, you watch a guy like Holly Holm, when that happened, they said 100 pay-per-views ago at 193. It's, you see somebody, they get hit, they get caught, boom, they're out. That's a different kind of thing. This was a dismantling in a very strange way, in a wheelhouse that Izzy plays in. This is norm. This is where he wants to be, right? Like, this is where he wants to be. It's going to take a minute to process that, isn't it? I mean, I think it played out in a way that I could have never envisioned. And again, I said he had no chance. I was trying to find that route to victory, what Strickland could do. We were talking about him dropping the ball on the big stage, maybe having some of that stage fright. Instead, he's the picture of poise and stuck to a game plan and was able to execute it. And I don't know if I've ever been that kind of like, what the hell just happened in watching a fight.
PT.
I didn't think we could outdo the Irene Aldana episode, but here we are, lads. Sean Strickland, and we have egg all over our faces once again.
Oh my God.
I said he wouldn't win a round. And it turns out Adesanya was the one scraping around. I only had him winning the second. And I think what Chuck said is right. Like, these guys are both strikers. We know that about them. But they're the antithesis of each other in terms of the style bender. This guy of 1,000 techniques. And then you have Strickland with this stripped down front kick, jab, straight. And the Bruce Lee quote was ringing in my head when I was watching it. I don't know if you've ever heard this. I'm sure you have. Don't fear the man who knows 1,000 techniques, but fear the man who has practiced one technique 1,000 times.
Right.
And that's what we saw there tonight. Like, this was rudimentary, but expertly done. And at one stage, Eric Nixick said to Sean Strickland, he's like a snake charmer, but it's almost like Izzy hypnotized himself at times with these feints. It's like he got so wrapped up in it that I felt like he wasn't unloading like he usually did. But absolutely incredible from Strickland. I can't believe it. I literally cannot believe that happened. I can't believe we just watched that.
By the way, I'm happy that you mentioned Eric Nixick. What an unbelievable performance at him. We got some snippets, in between rounds. You have to speak to fighters in different ways, right? You have to know how to speak their language. He's not talking to Francis Ngannou like that, but he's talking to Sean, and you see Sean responding. The one thing I'll say is Sean didn't really listen to his pleas to grapple. In the end, he didn't really need to grapple. It was unbelievable to watch Sean walk out and see him, at least I think from my set of eyes, to be a little bit nervous, a little bit sort of frozen in the moment. And in the end, what that really was a guy who was 1,000% confident, 1,000% focused, and just ready to go do the work. I compared this rivalry, if you will, to Chael Sonnen and Anderson Silva. And I was wondering if the triangle choke was going to come in the end. But in the end, he finished what Chael did at UFC 117. He went the distance and he got the job done. In the end, the judges all got it right, and they all agreed with us. Every single judge scored rounds 1, 3, 4, and 5 for Sean Strickland.
That's pretty amazing in itself, isn't it?
Yes.
Pretty amazing.
They gave Israel the second round. Let's give him a shout out. Eric Colon, David Letheby, Clemens Werner. I thought maybe they would give Sean a 10-8 in the first, and I was wondering if that was going to, loom large throughout the fight, but in the end, it didn't matter. And so in the end, you look at this fight and you compare it to the guy who fought Alex Pereira back in July of 2022 when we were in Las Vegas. It's a completely different fighter. It's not even the same fighter who fought Jared Cannonier at the end of last year. It's a completely different fighter. I can't recall a guy rise, a massive underdog like Sean Strickland was going into tonight, rising to the occasion like he did tonight. You know what I mean? Like, TJ Dillashaw had a great performance against Hannah Barrow. Holly Holm had a great performance, but I don't think, and maybe this is, hindsight, but I don't think the gap was so big in retrospect. I think we'll look back on this and be like, how in the world did he perform at that level? And in the end, he got it done. And there's so many questions that you can ask about the performances. But again, we're still digesting this right now.
I love
because
this
Sean Strickland is the undisputed middleweight champion of the world.
It was almost like when Nixick was talking to him, and you're right to point this out, because it was almost like he was cutting off some larger collective psychic understanding of what was trying to take place at the pass, right? Like he came in there and he said something along the lines of, we're not going to lose a boring fight to this guy, meaning he had, they had talked about being in a situation where he might be getting nickel and dimed with counters very uneventfully, and at the end of the scorecard, right, it would all of a sudden be Izzy 3-2 or whatever it's going to be. You could tell they were prepared for that. Like that's a mental edge that he communicated to the world right there. And the fact that disruption, just with the jab, using his length just in general and keeping Izzy from ever getting settled, I think it really speaks to how dialed in. This should also reflect, I think, Nixick. I really do, man, because I think that they were really dialed in to what they were going to do. And Strickland to execute it was actually, this is where I was skeptical. I thought, and I said this, and I mean, we could go through a million, you could play all the sound bites, we sound like idiots for an hour, or at least I would, because I was like, Izzy will punish that aggression. I know that I know that Strickland is a high volume guy. You knew he was going to get in his face. You knew he'd cut angles. You knew he'd do all this stuff. But I thought Izzy at some point would just kind of time it out, and then bam, bam, it would be like put him on skates, and this is how it would end. This is how I really believed it would go. The fact that it just couldn't happen, and his confidence and everything that kind of happened there, it's just, I think they were really dialed in. So you bringing up Nixick right there, I think in my initial understanding, just that pairing and all this, everything that was going on there, that was pretty cool. I mean, I felt like they really showed up on the biggest stage ready for this.
And PT, I don't ask you this to try to take anything away from Sean Strickland and from his team, but I do wonder about a few things regarding Israel, and I want to get your take on this. He has been very active. Do we think that comes into play here? This fight was supposed to be him versus DDP. He really wanted to be on this card. It ends up being Sean Strickland. Do we think that, like the rest of the world, he took Sean Strickland for granted? And then let's be honest, this week, he was dealing with a lot of outside of the cage drama. You see him on Twitter. He's responding to like every troll in the Twitter sphere, in the X sphere, whatever the fuck you want to call it. Like, does it seem like he just wasn't all there? Does it seem like he wasn't, bringing his A game? Or by even asking that question, by even talking about this, are we taking away from the performance that Sean Strickland had?
I think that everyone was overlooking this situation. Like the talk, like if you look at our show on Thursday, we were like, this is going to set up Hamza and Adesanya. This is going to be all this stuff. And I'm sure like when you've been in that situation for as long as Stylebender has, like, somewhere in your mind, you have to be thinking, right, well, then I'm going here, then I'm doing this. And it's always the one that you sleep on, isn't it? It's always the one that you don't expect that comes along and does something like this to you. I don't think he recovered after the big moment the first. I know he had a good second round, but I think when he got cracked by him, that was the only time he realized that could happen. Like that was the first time he was like, wow, Sean Strickland can be putting it on me in this fight. And I see him when he was speaking to Nixick after, he's pointing to his jaw. So I don't know if he was saying something happened early in the first from the damage he took from Strickland. But the reality is, all of this is just a bigger ode to Strickland. The fact that we were looking past him, the fact that Izzy may have been, it just makes it all the more impressive for him. Anyway, it's part of this story. It's going to be part of the legend that is Strickland showing up in Australia and beating the biggest superstar in the sport.
It just Sean Strickland is 3-0, guys, in 2023. He is the front runner right now for male fight of the year. I just want you to.
All of this stuff is crazy, man.
Let that soak in. Let that soak in. And by the way, if Francis Ngannou somehow gets, they're saying the same thing about him against Tyson Fury. Put Eric Nixick in the freaking Hall of Fame.
God.
If
that happens, holy shit,
that might be the greatest year for any coach in the history of combat sports. I mean, he may be I haven't really thought about it much, but he may be the MMA coach of the year already. But I mean, he could do something even more magical in about a month and a half from now. Petesy.
Is it bizarre that Strickland, like, obviously the performance deserves this ovation, right? But just based on where he is in the world, I'm like imagining, like, say it's McGregor at the height of his power in Dublin, and someone came over and just jabbed the face off him for 5 rounds. I don't think the crowd are going to be like, yay, Sean. Like, that was pretty incredible from the Australian crowd. I can't believe that.
They absolutely loved him.
Weird.
Standing ovation. Yeah.
All week long. All week long they loved him. It's unbelievable. Now, that being said, that's kind of like in a bit of a, like what is it, like in a vacuum here, because he was kind of playing to the crowd. And let's not forget, Izzy isn't actually from Australia. We kind of always like lump it together, but he does train out of New Zealand. There's a bit of a rivalry there. He has done big things in Australia. But let's just be honest for a second. On a night where 2 F-bombs and not the okay ones are dropped on UFC broadcast, and we suspect nothing really is going to happen to these individuals. You got a guy like Sean Strickland who, would make a Colby Covington blush, or any real, like, pick a controversial UFC fighter, pick an outspoken UFC fighter, pick a sort of edgy UFC fighter. He'd make all of them blush. Is this a disaster for the UFC? On Tuesday's show, we were talking about how Izzy is like the biggest star, not named Conor, and the most active, and a dream for the UFC. Is this an actual disaster for the UFC? Or, I'll be honest with you, anytime I see anything regarding Sean Strickland, anytime I tweet anything somewhat critical of him, it's all people saying, I love him, I want to support him. I'm getting all of this. In fact, I remember saying this on the show when I was talking about the UFC being reluctant, and I want to talk about this more about booking this fight. And then when they officially announced it, all it was like, so happy he's getting the opportunity. Let's go, Sean. It wasn't like, holy shit, I can't. And I don't know what this says about our society, but he has a lot of supporters. I think to us, sane-minded people, it may feel like a nightmare, and I want to get your take on it. But do you think this seems like a nightmare for the UFC, business-wise, promotion-wise, future-wise?
The beautiful thing is that never goes away about the sport is you get an underdog like him, right? Like he was a huge underdog going into this fight. And that's why we're talking about it in historical context, right? Like he comes through, he's not your traditional underdog, right? Like he's not a guy that, at least in my mind, had that kind of sentiment behind him, but maybe it was bigger than we realized. And I think that there is something about it in general. Like when you're a big underdog and you're able to come through, the exhilaration of fight night, it's not disastrous. It's always the miracle of the sport. You're like, oh my God, this can happen. Now, when you go on and it starts to settle in, I think that's when it starts to be like, because we mentioned this before. There's only one guy who could ruin all of tomorrow's parties. Your imagination was alive now with Izzy in a lot of weird ways, and I think as cautious as we try to be in MMA, we were looking past Strickland. You're like, already, we're talking about Duplessis, we're talking about Hamzat, and what a big fight that is. We were sitting there going, man, is that the biggest fight that could happen in 2024? In that sense, yes, it is. I think it is a disaster. I think that you were setting up a guy who, and I was talking about this fight like it was a homecoming, like it should be a homecoming for him, that type of fight, and now you don't get it. The other part of it is, this is in his last 7 fights, he's 4-3. I mean, it's just, I know it's kind of different things, but like, a lot of the sheen, the thing that he has takes a blow, and I think that settles in. You know, the thing that we were building with him, I don't know what it is. You know, it's like we were talking about this before in the preview show. It starts to diminish, and I don't know how we'll look at him. Like people wanted to start calling him one of the best middleweights. You're putting him in conversations with all these guys, and it's going to take a blow. You know what I mean? So I think that when you really let it settle in, it will be, I don't know if disastrous is the right word, but it's not going to be, this wasn't the outcome the UFC probably wanted. You know what I mean? I think the better outcome was that he gets through Sean, we put him away. It'd be like if John Fitch upset, GSP back in the day. You'd be like, oh, Jesus, now what? You got John Fitch as your champ. You know what I mean? It's just one of those weird things you're going to have to deal with, but I don't think I think this was a bad scenario.